Is there any proof for Heim theory? Did you ever hear the term biophoton? You certainly will in this video, and I'm going to tell you how Burkhard Heim predicted their existence and why it proves his theory. Hello and welcome to 6 Dimensions in Color. My name is Schmid. On this channel I present to you Burkhard Heim's worldview in understandable language and with clear examples. In my trainings I teach you the NATHAL method. NATHAL allows you to access those realms of information which you previously thought were only open to the specially gifted. NATHAL creates the perfect balance between emotions and intellect and thus allows you to purposefully access your intuition. Check out my website if you're interested. My international trainings are based in Dubai, but I'm also offering them anywhere in the world. With Heim theory, we have arrived at the point where we can certainly say the life process, consciousness and consciousness phenomena are not just an epiphenomenon of dead matter and somehow arise from it. But we can also be certain that the life process is bound to matter and not independent from it. But we can also say that the life process is somehow bound to the material world. And in the previous videos of this series I introduced you to Heim's very complex yet ingenious model, which allows us to get some grasp and some new terms in which to talk about these interconnections. So we have this transcendent structure we call the ill-core, the intermittent lead metroplex of correlating properties, which we can identify as something as the psyche in a very broad sense. And from the body into the psyche ascend so-called streams of activities, which are basically sensory inputs. And on the other side, we have descending streams of activities, which are, well, physical degrees of freedom, so to say, degrees of freedom to move, to express oneself. And these activity streams, they are certainly correlated with consciousness. And Heim also made this classification how he ordered the living organisms into different degrees of consciousness and thereby different numbers of activity streams. So activity streams which form connections between the ill-core and the physical body, Heim called in particular telecore synchroclines. But if they are connected to the body, then that must mean they must have some effect. And what would this effect be? Burkhard Heim approached this question from a purely logical reasoning point of view. So he asked himself, if there is some controlling mechanism on the cellular level, what would it be? Well, the answer is very obvious, at least it is today, it's the DNA. He came up with the whole things in the late 60s. It was known that DNA plays a central role, but there were still open questions. Today it's quite clear. So we have DNA as a biological control mechanism. And Heim concluded that any kind of transcendent influence must start at the DNA, because that's the most basic process which living organisms thrive upon. That must mean there must be some physical process at the submolecular level in the DNA, which allows some kind of information transfer from the transcendent realms. And now it will finally become understandable why we have to start with Heim's concept of elementary particles if we want to understand the life process. If you remember, I think it was the second or third video of this series, I'll link it up here, then Heim had 4 different types of condensations or of Hermite forms. Let's use his term first. So the type C and D, they are about mass particles, about charged particles like electrons, protons, and non-charged particles like neutrons. So the basic nucleons the atoms are composed of. That was type C and D. Type B is about photons. Photons are not present in Heim's model. Photons have no spatial aspect. They are purely transcendent temporal phenomena, which is the main reason why photons can superimpose in space, but that's a different matter. And then there is form A, which are purely transcendent things. He called them activities, and it's what I'm talking about when I'm talking of streams of activities. So the things that influence matter, the ill core, is composed of activities, which means A terms. And activity streams are obviously also composed of A terms. And now a physical molecule, which is composed of much more than A terms, has to be influenced somehow. And Heim reasoned the following way. He said, well, in C and D hermitry forms, mass particles, the A terms, which are always attached, they are much too feeble, so to say, to make any significant effect, to make any alteration to their quantum states, to be precise. Apart from that, there are no observations of free protons or neutrons inside the DNA, and good so, because it would raise questions about how would DNA remain stable. It would be a severe cause of all kinds of mutations anyway. So the remaining possibility, Heim concluded, was that the A terms, the transcendent activities, they interact with photons, or with a photon field. In photons, the A terms of the photons themselves are dominant enough to make any significant effect. And that would mean that the DNA itself is a photon resonator. And as a consequence, the DNA should be emitting coherent photons on a continuous basis in a spectrum which would range, according to Heim, from visible to infrared spectrum. And through this photon field, the transcendent terms influence the DNA activity, the DNA expression. And this precisely has been proven not long after Heim postulated this idea of his I just outlined to you, and without his knowledge. Another German physicist, Professor Fritz-Albert Popp, had observed that there is ultra-weak light coming out of living cells. He came to observe that because he was interested in the role of ultraviolet light in cell communication, and especially during its role during cancer formation. His observations led him to the conclusion that coherent light emissions from living cells and from living DNA play a central role in cell communication throughout the whole organism and health. His experiments aimed to detect and measure the properties of these, what he called later biophotons. And he certainly could determine that they are not some dirt effect from thermoluminescence or something like that, that they are really a coherent quantum field, emissions from a coherent quantum field. He determined the spectrum. The spectrum was in the range of visible to ultraviolet. He was focusing on ultraviolet mainly. And his discovery opened up a whole new field of study, which led to completely new ideas about how cellular communication and biological regulations work. Well, biophotons fit surprisingly well into what Heim predicted. First of all, their coherence. Heim was a little off on the spectrum. He did not expect that it would extend so far into the ultraviolet. But he certainly could say that they would play a central role, or appear to play a central role, in cellular communication and biological regulation. Every robust theory makes predictions about phenomena before they are observed, and that is what happened here. Heim could predict the existence of a biophoton a few years before Fritz-Albert Popp discovered them. So biophotons are the second major pillar of Heim theory, alongside the mass formula. However, after his discovery, Fritz-Albert Popp faced major challenges. After he published his works in 1972, he was then, some years later, quoted or misquoted by an esoteric magazine, and from then on, of course, his reputation suffered. But nonetheless, he continued his work and laid the foundation to this whole field of biophoton research. He became internationally very renowned. In fact, not so much within Germany. Most of the critics were coming from his own country. But internationally, especially in Eastern Europe and Asia, there were many scientists who really appreciated his work and continued his study and continue his studies to the present day. It's quite natural that works like Heim's and Popp's attract mystical interpretations. And while these can be distracting from the scientific core, they also show the profound nature of their discoveries. Biophotons, with their coherent photon fields, suggest an organizational potential far beyond biochemical reactions. I would now like to point out one aspect of the biophotons once more, which is the coherent nature of the photon field. According to the terms in which we usually measure, calculate and talk about quantum phenomena, it has merely gigantic dimensions. They are still microscopic to the human eye, but they are gigantic. They are extending over huge ranges, much larger than the single particles we usually do physics with them. And this coherence is naturally a consequence of the X5 organizational potential that's taking effect here. It means nothing else than the photons cannot behave in any other different way, because their probability states are held in place, so to say, by a higher, well, it's tempting to use the word force here. It's not a force in the sense of force in Newton, but it's an organizational potential that influences probability states. So from a higher organizational states, the probability is imposed on the photon field to behave coherently over a huge range, over the whole cell, the whole organism, whatever. Since Heim's and Popp's discovery, a lot more has been learned about coherent quantum states in living matter. Take, for example, Nobel Prize winners Roger Penrose and anesthesiologist Stuart Hameroff's hypothesis on they proposed a model linking coherent quantum states and microtubuli to consciousness processes. Microtubuli are, it's called the cytoskeleton of a eukaryotic cell. It is a cell with a cell nucleus. It has this kind of, well, yeah, like a skeleton, minuscule fibers which hold the cell in place and which enable it to move around. These microtubules are composed of certain proteins, and inside these tubules, well, they can be a substrate for certain quantum states. That's what Penrose and Hameroff based their research on. Another team at the University of Berkeley has worked on the energy transfer during photosynthesis, and it could be shown that quantum states, coherent quantum states of electrons, play the central role here, and they allow an energy transfer within the cell and within certain molecules that is 100% efficient and which is far off the thermodynamic equilibrium you would expect at room temperature. Mind, we're talking about quantum states which are highly unlikely by any conventional understanding. And that's why they can only be understood if something influences this probability state. I now want to go and try to integrate these newer findings with Heim theory. If I'm drawing these pictures, it always appears like there are docking points, and also Heim talked of docking points of the synchroclines on the physical body. Of course, this is meant metaphorically. There's not one particular region where a synchrocline docks. It is, if it's a docking point, it means the whole of the DNA or the whole of a certain organ or whatever. But we want to try to identify these docking structures, let's call them structures, and coherent quantum states of such low thermodynamical probability might give a good indication where to look. If you remember the previous video, I had asked the question how Heim came to his classification and numbers of synchroclines and of levels of consciousness. my conclusion was he did not really count. He just derived a general law of progression to somehow have a system where to put the different complexity of living organisms. But it fits astonishingly well, and it also fits here as well. So Stewart's and Hameroff's hypothesis that microtubuli have something to do with consciousness, they suggest that the microtubuli at least offer a new docking point for a second synchrocline. The complexity level of the eukaryotic cell is precisely where Heim allocated his first duplication of synchroclines. That is where he thought the one synchrocline organizing basic molecules and viruses and bacteria, etc., it must split up into two streams, which can afford to organize the more complex organisms of more complex processes within the eukaryotic cell. So Penrose-Hameroff provide a clue where it again coincides with Heim theory that the microtubuli provide this first duplication step. But it's important to point out the difference here between their hypothesis and Heim, because for Heim, explicitly the biophoton field does not give rise to, or the quantum states in general, we're talking generally here, they do not give rise to consciousness itself. They are a consequence of a higher organizational potential. Penrose and Hameroff postulated that consciousness itself arises from these quantum states. They are like causing it, or at least. But that's not how it works with Heim theory. So quantum coherence for Heim is a secondary phenomenon. So to conclude the matter, it sometimes amuses me how quickly popular science and popular interpretations about findings of quantum coherence, etc., they jump to conclusions about, well, quantum states, quantum computers, quantum consciousness, etc., without really having a theory behind it. But nonetheless promising very quickly that we are now only one step away from understanding, from constructing our own consciousness, our unconscious computer. However, if we observe and try to understand the puzzling, the mesmerizing properties of consciousness, we must humbly admit we are still quite a long way from it. We are still a long way from replicating such things technologically. We may be one day. And if we have come so far, I think we will have concluded that what we will construct is not so far away from the original. We may even observe the physical body that we possess is the best matrix to carry anything that we are trying to emulate today. So first we must embark on that journey to understand our own consciousness and all its multidimensional and vibrant complexity. So thanks for watching, and stay tuned for more explorations into the mysteries of consciousness and the physical world in 6 dimensions and in color.